I was 34 years old the afternoon I sat across a mediation table from my own in-laws and quietly agreed to give them everything they'd come to fight for. Lenora Holt actually smiled when I signed. She had no idea what she'd just been handed. But this story really starts 8 months before that, on the afternoon of my daughter's 10th birthday, with a cake I never got to finish cutting. My name is Marion Holt. I'm a forensic accountant. I spend my working life finding the one number in a business that doesn't add up, the one everyone else missed or didn't want to find. At my daughter Elodie's own birthday party, in front of 40 people holding paper plates, my mother-in-law stood up and announced that she and my father-in-law had filed a legal petition for scheduled guardianship visitation and to be named co-trustees of Elodie's Education Trust. She said it the way you'd announce a menu change. I didn't put my fork down. I didn't raise my voice. I just kept cutting my daughter's cake. But there was one detail Lenora had never once bothered to check in 8 years of assuming she knew exactly how much power she held over that trust. And there was a second detail, one I wasn't even looking for, that I only found because she made the mistake of asking the accountant in the family for a favor. 6 weeks later, a phone call at 11 at night would tell me exactly how much power I actually had. 8 months after that, in a mediation room with a court reporter typing every word, my mother-in-law would learn she'd spent a small fortune on lawyers fighting for a trust that was never hers to touch, while quietly signing away the one thing that actually was. And nobody in that family ever saw it coming from quiet, careful Marion, the one who just did everyone's taxes. Welcome back to Calm Stories, where the ones everyone thought they could out-negotiate finally tell you the whole thing, calmly, start to finish. If a quiet kind of justice is your thing, settle in, drop a comment, and tell me where you're listening from tonight. And hit subscribe so you don't miss exactly how this one ends. Let me back up. I built my practice out of a spare bedroom in Ashcombe, the kind of small town where the accountant and the dentist and the man who fixes your roof all end up at the same Little League bleachers on Saturday mornings. 11 years ago, I had one client, a hardware store on Fenn Street, and a laptop that overheated if I ran 2 spreadsheets at once. I did that store's books at the kitchen table of a rented duplex, wearing a cardigan indoors because we kept the heat low to save money. By the time Elodie turned 10, I had a real office over the pharmacy on Main Street, 4 employees, a waiting list every January, and a brass plaque on the door that still made me a little proud every time I unlocked it at 7 in the morning. I kept my father's old adding machine on the corner of my desk, even though I never once used it for actual work. He'd been a bookkeeper at a bottling plant for 31 years, the kind of man who wrote down what he spent on coffee in a little spiral notebook he kept in his shirt pocket. He used to tell me, a number doesn't lie to you, but it will let you lie to yourself if you don't write it down fast enough to catch it. I loved him for sentences like that. I still hear them at strange times, usually right before I need them. I married Theo Holt when I was 26. He manages commercial construction projects around 3 counties, steady work, careful hands, the kind of man who reads the whole contract before he signs anything except, as it turned out, the unspoken ones inside his own family. For the most part, the Holts liked me well enough, in the specific way some families like a person who stays useful and stays quiet. The Holts weren't loud people, and that was the trap of them. Lenora ran her whole life the way she ran the church fundraising committee, with a warm smile, a seating chart, and a very clear private ledger of who owed her something. Roy, my father-in-law, mostly stood beside her the way a lamp stands beside a couch. Present, warm-looking, never once the person anybody thought to ask a direct question. The one Holt who actually saw me, really saw me, from the very first Thanksgiving I ever sat at that table, was Theo's grandfather, Gideon. Gideon had built the family's first rental property with his own 2 hands back in 1969, working nights and weekends for 3 years before he ever collected $1 of rent on it. And he spent the following 5 decades quietly, politely, never once trusting his own son's judgment about money, for reasons he never fully explained to a single member of the family, though he apparently explained plenty to his attorney. When Elodie was born, Gideon showed up at the hospital in his good coat, holding a small jeweler's box with a thin silver charm bracelet inside, and exactly one charm already on it, a tiny book, because he said a Holt girl ought to grow up owning at least one thing nobody could ever talk her out of. He added a charm every birthday after that, a little compass, the year she learned to ride a bike without training wheels, out on the cracked driveway at his place, both of them scraped up and laughing. A little apple the year she started kindergarten. He died 6 weeks after her 6th birthday, in his sleep, the easiest way a hard-working man could ask to go. And my hands were the ones that clasped that bracelet onto her wrist every year after, because nobody else in that family remembered the tradition existed until I quietly reminded them. What I did not know, not for years, was that in that same season, he bought the first charm. Gideon had also gone to his attorney in the next county over and set up a modest, carefully worded education trust for Elodie, with one very specific instruction attached to it. His granddaughter's mother, and only his granddaughter's mother, would ever serve as trustee. Not Lenora, not Roy. He never told Theo why. He never told me at all. I only knew the trust existed the vague way you know a great aunt exists somewhere. A fact mentioned once or twice at holidays and never actually examined by anyone in the room. I want you to understand the kind of comment I'd been quietly absorbing from Lenora for years before any of this happened, because it matters for what came later. At a Thanksgiving when Elodie was 7, Lenora raised her wineglass to toast the meal and worked in, almost sweetly, that she certainly hoped Marion's little tax business would still be around by the time Elodie needed real college money. The table laughed the comfortable laugh of people who've already decided a joke is fair. I laughed too. I was good at that by then. A year later, at Elodie's school open house, Lenora told another mother, well within my hearing, that she worried sometimes about a household that ran on, and I remember the exact phrase, unpredictable freelance income, as though I hadn't billed $41,000 that quarter alone. I'd spent my whole life being underestimated by people who mistook my calm for something soft, and I'd learned that correcting them in the moment never once changed their mind. It only cost me the room. So I let it go, the way I'd let 100 small comments go before it, and I kept doing everyone's taxes for free every April, including Lenora and Roy's, because that's what family did. And because some tired, dutiful part of me still believed they would eventually notice I was worth more than a discount. Elodie's 10th birthday was a Saturday in June, held in our own backyard. String lights Theo had put up the night before. 40 people on folding chairs eating cake off paper plates, while a speaker played the kind of playlist a 10-year-old picks herself. Lenora arrived 20 minutes late in a cream-colored dress that was not, in any sense, a backyard party dress, which should have told me something the second she stepped through the side gate. She waited until the cake was cut, until half the yard had a fork in one hand and a plate balanced on a knee, and then she stood up the way you stand up to give a toast. She thanked everyone for coming. She talked, warmly, about family and legacy, in the same soft, practiced voice she used for announcing the church rummage sale. And then she said that she and Roy had retained an attorney and that they had filed for scheduled, court-recognized visitation with their granddaughter and that they intended to petition to be named co-trustees, alongside me, of the education trust Gideon had left Elodie. She used the word alongside like it was a gift she was extending. She said all of it in front of 40 people holding paper plates, most of whom had no real idea what a trust even was, only that something serious had just happened out loud at a child's birthday party. Then, gently, the way you'd note a fact about the weather, she added that she only wanted to be certain Elodie's future was being handled responsibly, given how unpredictable small businesses could be. Given how unpredictable small businesses could be. She was talking about my practice, at my daughter's birthday, in front of my daughter, in front of my daughter's second-grade teacher, in front of the neighbor who mowed our lawn when Theo traveled for work. I didn't put my fork down. I didn't look at Theo, because if I'd looked at Theo in that exact moment, I might have said something in front of 40 witnesses that I couldn't have taken back. I finished cutting the next slice of cake and handed it across the table to Elodie's teacher, who was watching me with the particular careful blankness of a woman deciding whether to pretend she hadn't heard any of it. I smiled the smile you use when the alternative is worse. I did not correct Lenora in that yard, not one word of it. You don't hand someone the scene they came for. Theo found me in the kitchen an hour later, once the last guests had finally gone, both of us still holding paper plates, like neither of us had remembered how to set them down. He was every bit as blindsided as I was, and that fact did two things to me at once. It was a relief, because it meant this wasn't something he'd quietly agreed to behind my back over some Sunday phone call I hadn't been part of, and it was its own separate wound, because it meant his own parents hadn't thought either of us worth a conversation first, not even a warning. We sat at that kitchen table until well past midnight, running through every possible version of what alongside could mean, and neither one of us could make it mean anything good. Elodie herself asked me about it the next morning, over cereal, in the direct, unblinking way 10-year-olds ask the questions adults spend years learning how to avoid. She wanted to know what a trustee was, and whether Grandma Lenora saying it in front of everyone meant Elodie had done something wrong at her own party. I knelt down so we were eye to eye, the way I do when I want her to know I'm not going to hand her a smaller version of the truth. I told her she hadn't done one single thing wrong, that grown-ups sometimes turned money questions into performances at exactly the moments they should least be performances, and that whatever happened next was entirely mine and her father's to sort out, not hers. She nodded slowly, the way she does when she's filing something away instead of fully accepting it, and then she asked if she still got to keep the bracelet. That question undid me more than anything Lenora had said all afternoon. Of course, I told her, that was never anyone's to take. She seemed satisfied with that, in the easy way children can be satisfied by a true sentence, and went back to her cereal, and I stood in my own kitchen and understood, freshly, exactly how much was actually at stake underneath all the legal language. I called an attorney the following Monday morning, before I'd even had coffee. Ines Calder had handled a business dispute for one of my longtime clients 2 years earlier, sharp and unhurried, the kind of person who lets a silence sit at the table until you're the one who fills it with the truth, instead of the version you'd rather tell. I laid it all out for her, the trust, the petition, Gideon, the exact word alongside. She asked me one question before anything else. Do you currently have a copy of the original trust document in your possession? I told her I didn't. As far as I knew, nobody in the family did. Gideon's attorney had retired years earlier, and the small firm had changed hands twice since. Ines told me getting a certified copy would take weeks, possibly longer, and that until we had it in hand, we were all arguing about a fact none of us could actually prove yet, no matter how certain any of us felt. In the meantime, she said, don't sign anything, don't agree to anything informally, and above all, don't let them see you rattled. Rattled is exactly what they're hoping for, she told me. A rattled woman makes mistakes on paper, and paper is the only thing that survives long enough to matter. I want to tell you about the mistake I almost made anyway, because I think some of you will recognize the shape of it. 2 weeks after the birthday, Lenora called, warm and easy, to say that the guardianship visitation piece, the actual court schedule, one defined Saturday a month with Elodie, was a separate, simpler filing entirely, and could we please just agree to it informally so nobody had to drag a 10-year-old through anything resembling a courtroom. She sounded, for the first time in 2 weeks, like a woman trying to keep the peace instead of win a war. And because I wanted so badly to believe there was still some version of this family that loved my daughter more than it loved being right, I said yes. I agreed, on the spot, over the phone, to let Elodie spend that very first scheduled Saturday overnight at Lenora and Roy's, alone, no discussion, no waiting for Ines's advice, nothing. Theo asked me twice, later that evening, if I was sure. I told him it was one night, and that saying yes to the small thing might buy us goodwill on the large one. I want you to sit with that decision for just a second, the way I have, more than once, since. It wasn't a bad night. Elodie came home the next afternoon sunburned across her nose, full of a long story about a gin rummy tournament she'd apparently won twice. But I gave something away that week for no better reason than being tired of always being the one who said no, and tired, I have learned, is a genuinely terrible reason to make a decision about your own child, even in a case where nothing at all goes wrong. If you've ever been the reasonable one in a family that only ever rewards you for staying reasonable, I want you to do something for me right now. Drop a comment and just let me know you're still here, because the part where this whole thing actually starts to turn is coming, and I don't want you to miss exactly how it happens. Hit subscribe so it finds you. The turn started with Roy, not with Lenora, which surprised me more than almost anything else in this entire story. He called my office directly on a Tuesday morning, not the house line, my office, using the number printed on my business card like I was a stranger he needed a professional favor from, and in a way, I suppose, I was, and I suppose he did. He asked, quietly, almost embarrassed, whether I'd be willing to look over some numbers for him and Lenora, informally, strictly as a professional, not as family. He added, lower still, that Lenora didn't know he was calling me. I sat with that for a moment before I said yes, because whatever else was true about Roy Holt, I had never once, in 8 years of Sunday dinners, heard him ask anyone in that family for help with anything. He brought a banker's box to my office 2 days later, not the house, my office, and he looked smaller sitting across my own desk than I had ever once seen him look at the head of theirs. The Holts owned 6 rental properties spread across 2 counties, a portfolio Gideon had built slowly, in cash, over half a century, entirely debt-free by the time he died. Roy and Lenora had spent the last 4 years leveraging that portfolio hard, refinancing 3 of the 6 properties to fund an ambitious flip on a 4th, a Victorian on Delmar Street that was supposed to double their money inside a single year. The flip had stalled badly. The contractor had walked off the job 8 months in, with half the kitchen torn out and a deposit that was never coming back. They were now carrying more combined debt against those properties than the properties were currently worth, current on every payment so far, but only because Roy had been quietly draining his own retirement account for over a year to cover the monthly gap, a fact he had not yet found a way to tell his wife. I want to be honest with you about the moment I actually understood what I was looking at, because it wasn't triumph, it was something much closer to grief. Roy sat across from me, 68 years old, a man who had spent his whole life being the lamp beside the couch, and he told me, in a voice gone thin and careful, that his own father had lost everything once, a business, a house, all of it, to a bad handshake partnership when Roy was 9 years old, and that he had grown up terrified, in a way he had never once said out loud to another living person, of dying the same way his father had, with nothing left to show for a whole working life. He said Lenora didn't know how bad it had actually gotten, because he had never found a way to tell her that didn't sound, in his own head, exactly like failure. He asked me, sitting in my office with his hands folded like a man at confession, whether there was any way to fix it before it became something Lenora had to learn about from a bank's letter instead of from him. I have found, over 11 years of reading other people's numbers for a living, that the people most afraid of being seen as broke are very often the ones who have spent the longest pretending to be fine. Fear dressed up as pride is still, underneath it, only ever fear. I told him I would look at everything properly and get back to him within the week. I did not tell him, that day, what I already half suspected, which was that there was no version of fixing this that didn't involve someone in the family absorbing real, significant risk. And I did not tell him that the timing of his call, 6 weeks after his wife stood up at my daughter's birthday and announced, in front of 40 people, that she didn't fully trust my judgment with money, struck me as either a remarkable coincidence or no coincidence whatsoever. I did one more thing before I let myself fully believe what Roy had shown me, because I don't build a professional opinion on a single source, family or otherwise. I drove to the county recorder's office myself, on my own lunch hour, and pulled the public mortgage filings on all 6 Holt properties, the same records anyone off the street can request at the counter for a small copying fee. Nothing about it involved a locked drawer, or a private conversation I wasn't supposed to overhear. It took 40 minutes and $11 in copies, and every filing matched exactly what Roy had already told me, down to the dollar. There is a particular flatness to a public record, no emotion in it anywhere, just recorded dates and recorded numbers, and it confirmed the shape of the trap far more coldly than Roy's own worried voice ever could have on its own. I sat in my car in the county lot afterward, with the folder on the passenger seat, and understood that I now knew something Lenora herself did not yet fully know about her own family's finances, and that whatever I decided to do with that knowledge, I would be the only person at the next family dinner holding the entire picture. I didn't tell anyone what I'd found. Not yet. You don't hand someone the shape of a trap you're still quietly building around yourself, even when you didn't build the first piece of it on purpose. Inez called 4 days later with the trust document, finally located and certified from the old firm's archived files. I read it standing up at my own kitchen counter, twice, out loud the second time through, because I needed to hear the words as much as see them printed. Gideon had written it exactly the way I'd hoped, and exactly the way, somewhere underneath the hope, I had already suspected. The trustee, named specifically, permanently, irrevocably, was Elodie's mother. Not a title that could pass along with a divorce or a remarriage or a change of heart. Mother. One line further down, in the plain, almost gentle language of a man who had apparently anticipated this exact moment, decades before it ever arrived, Gideon had written that no other party, including but not limited to the grandparents of the beneficiary, shall at any time hold trustee authority over this instrument. He had thought of them specifically, and written them out generally, which was, I came to understand, over the following weeks, exactly Gideon's particular style. Kind to their faces at every Thanksgiving table. Precise on paper where it actually counted. Inez was quiet on the phone for a moment after I finished reading it to her. Well, she finally said, that's the entire case. Right there. There's nothing left to litigate. They can petition however they'd like. A judge is going to read this document in about 90 seconds and ask everyone in the room why they're still there. Here is the part I have never fully been able to make Theo's family understand, even now, and it's the part that ended up turning the whole rest of this story. I did not call Lenora that night, or the next, and quietly deliver 90 seconds of legal reading that would end her entire petition before it truly began. Because somewhere in the 4 days between Roy's visit and Inez's phone call, I had started to understand something else entirely, something the trust document alone couldn't fix. Lenora's real fight was never actually about the trust. The trust was theater. The refinance, the one nobody but Roy and I knew the true shape of yet, was the actual emergency underneath it. And a woman who is quietly drowning doesn't need you to prove, in front of a judge, that she can't swim. She needs someone to either pull her out or step back and let the water do what water does. And I hadn't yet decided, honestly, which one I was even willing to be. If you've ever known exactly how a fight was going to end weeks before the other person did, and had to sit there anyway, patient, calm, waiting for the right room to finally say it in out loud, stay with me. The part where I decide what to actually do with everything I know is coming, and I promise you it's worth every minute of the wait. Subscribe now so you don't miss it. I ran a small test before I let myself make a final decision. The same kind of test I run with a business client when I want to see how a shaky number behaves under a little honest pressure. At a Sunday dinner, when Lenora asked, in front of Theo and Roy both, whether I'd had a chance to look everything over yet, for Roy, I said, evenly, that I needed 1 more week before I could tell them anything useful. I watched her face change in real time, the way you watch a thermostat drop. The warmth she'd been performing for me for the better part of a month, the sudden compliments on Elodie's report card, the newly enthusiastic interest in my wonderful little practice, cooled by a solid 15 degrees in the space of that one sentence. Roy looked down at his plate. Lenora said, lightly, in a tone with an edge folded into the middle of it, that she certainly hoped family didn't need a whole week just to help family. I told her I understood completely, and that she'd have an answer soon. I drove home that night with both hands steady on the wheel, and absolutely no doubt left in me about what she actually wanted from me in all of this. And it had never once, not for a single afternoon, been my presence at a birthday party. Somewhere in that same stretch of weeks, I drove out to see my own mother, mostly because I needed to sit in a kitchen that didn't belong to the Holts for one afternoon. My mother had lived alone since my father's death, in the same small house on Independence Street where I'd grown up, and she still kept his old spiral notebooks in a shoebox on the hall closet's top shelf, 31 years of coffee purchases and gas fill-ups, and the exact itemized cost of my orthodontia, all recorded in his cramped, patient handwriting. I hadn't opened that shoebox in years. That afternoon, for no reason I could fully explain even to her, I asked to see it. We sat at her kitchen table and went through it page by page, and near the very bottom, tucked into the back cover of the last notebook he ever filled, I found a single folded page that wasn't in his usual columns at all. It was a letter, unfinished, addressed to me, dated the spring before he died. It said, in part, that he'd never had much money to leave me, but that he'd spent 31 years making sure every dollar that ever passed through his hands could be accounted for, because a person who can always show her work can never be told a story about herself that isn't true. He never finished the letter. I don't think he needed to. My mother watched me read it and said, quietly, that he would have liked Gideon, the two of them being the exact same particular kind of careful man, and I sat in that kitchen and cried for the first time since the birthday party, not out of grief exactly, but out of the strange, specific comfort of realizing I had been raised, twice over, by two men who had each spent their whole working lives building a kind of protection I wouldn't fully understand the shape of until the year I actually needed it. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a house the week before you finally decide to stop protecting people from a truth they've earned. I didn't sleep well that week. I sat up more than one night at the kitchen table with Gideon's trust document and Roy's banker's box spread out under the same lamp, running the numbers again and again, less because I doubted them, and more because I needed my hands to stay busy, while the rest of me caught up to what I already knew. Theo found me there at 1 a.m, halfway through that week, and didn't ask what I was doing. He just sat down across from me in his undershirt, poured us both 2 fingers of the bourbon his own grandfather used to keep in the hall closet, and said, quietly, that whatever I decided, he was already on my side of the table, and had been since the day of the party, and simply hadn't known yet how to prove it. That is the kind of sentence that gets a person through the rest of a hard week. Ines and I built the actual plan over the 2 weeks that followed, and it was the opposite, in almost every particular, of what anyone in that family expected of me. We would not contest the guardianship visitation. Elodie liked her grandparents, in the uncomplicated way children like people who give them cake and stay up too late playing cards, and fighting that in front of a judge would have cost my daughter far more than it would ever cost Lenora, so we let it stand, exactly as filed. I would also tell Roy, completely and honestly, everything the numbers actually showed him, the real current value of all 6 properties, the real weight of the debt sitting against them, the 12 months at most before the arrangement collapsed under its own quiet momentum, refinance or not. What I would not do, under any circumstance, was sign a single document putting my name, or our household's credit, anywhere near that refinance. And I would not let the trustee question get quietly settled at somebody's kitchen table, off the record, where either side could later claim it had never really been decided at all. Ines had a phrase for the whole strategy that I still think about often. Give them the room to walk all the way into the thing they're building, she told me. Don't build one plank of it for them, but don't stand in the doorway stopping them either. Theo went to see his parents alone once before any of it, without me, the week after we settled on the plan. I want to include that, because I think it matters. Whatever his mother had done, she was still his mother, and I never once wanted him to feel like loving her and standing beside me were 2 different teams he had to choose between. He came home a little after 9 that night and told me it hadn't gone well, that he'd tried to get Lenora to simply talk to him honestly about the properties, parent to adult child, no lawyers in the room, and that she'd told him he was taking my side against his own family, as though there had ever been a version of this where telling the truth belonged to a side at all. He sat on the edge of our bed and said, quietly, that he loved his mother and was furious with her in the same breath, and that he hadn't known those two things could sit in a chest at the same time without one of them winning. I told him I understood exactly what that felt like, better than he probably realized, and that he didn't owe anyone a winner between them. The mediation was set for a Thursday in February, 8 months to the week after the birthday party, called at Lenora's own attorney's request once it became clear that a courtroom fight over an airtight trust would be expensive, public, and entirely unwinnable in a town the size of Ashcombe. Ines suggested we use that same session to finally put on the record the family financial conversation Lenora had been quietly pressing Roy to arrange for weeks, the one where, right up until that very morning, she still believed Theo and I were about to help refinance their way out of a hole she did not yet know the true depth of. I agreed to it. 1 room, 1 folder, every single piece of paper in it true. The night before, I sat alone in Elodie's room after she'd fallen asleep, the charm bracelet resting in its little dish on her dresser, catching the hallway light. I picked it up and held it for a long time, running my thumb over the tiny silver book Gideon had chosen first, the one that started all of it. I wasn't thinking about Lenora, or the refinance, or even the mediation waiting for me the next morning. I was thinking about a man who had spent 50 years being quietly right about the people closest to him, and never once said so out loud, and about the fact that some kinds of protection only get discovered decades after the person who built them is gone. I set the bracelet back down exactly where I'd found it, and for the first time in 8 months, I slept the whole night through. The mediation room had a long table, a mediator named Mrs. Abernathy who ran things with the patience of a woman who had seen every possible version of this exact morning before, and a young court reporter typing quietly at the far end, which Ines had told me to think of, not as a threat, but as a witness who couldn't be talked out of what she'd heard later over coffee. Lenora wore the same cream-colored dress she'd worn to the birthday party, which I don't believe for 1 second was an accident. Roy sat beside her, smaller than I had ever seen him, even smaller than he'd looked in my office 2 months earlier. Theo sat beside me. I kept both hands flat on the folder in my lap, and I did not open it until it was time. Lenora's attorney opened with the trustee petition, full of warm, careful language about a grandmother's love and a family's shared responsibility for a child's whole future. Ines let him finish every last word of it. Then she placed Gideon's original trust document on the table, slid it across, and said, simply, that the language was entirely unambiguous, that she was confident Mrs. Abernathy would arrive at the same reading in roughly the time it took to read it, and that her clients would very much like to resolve this particular matter today so the room could move on to whatever actually needed discussing. Mrs. Abernathy read it. She looked up once, at Lenora, not unkindly at all. "There's nothing to mediate here," she said, gently. "This was decided a long time ago, by someone who isn't in this room anymore, and decided about as clearly as I've ever seen anyone decide anything." Lenora's face didn't crack yet. It just went very still, the particular stillness of a woman recalculating something in real time, right there at the table. Then, in the silence that followed, Lenora did exactly what Ines and I had both quietly predicted she would. She turned the conversation herself, because she still believed, right up until that moment, that she was holding one card left to play. "Well," she said, smoothing the front of her dress with both hands, "since we're all here, as family, Roy and I do need to speak with you both about the properties." I let her finish. I let her describe, in the same soft, hopeful voice she'd clearly rehearsed more than once in a mirror somewhere, what a modest bridge loan, co-signed by Theo and me, could do to stabilize everything while they sold one property properly, instead of at a fire sale loss. She used the word legacy twice in under a minute. She did not use the word debt even a single time. I opened the folder. I laid the pages down one at a time, the way you'd read a verdict aloud that you hadn't actually written yourself, because in the truest sense, I hadn't. the current mortgage balances against all 6 properties, the stalled contractor's lien on the Delmar Street house, the certified appraisals, current, nothing estimated or guessed at, and last, the statement from Roy's retirement account, which he himself had handed me, weeks earlier, in my own office, long before any of us sat down at this table together. I did not say a single unkind word while I did it. I said, plainly, that the properties, combined, currently carried more debt against them than they were worth on the open market, that the shortfall was real and not theoretical, and that I loved them both far too much to put my daughter's future, or my own household's credit, anywhere near a debt I had personally confirmed could not realistically be repaid on the terms being proposed. I told them I would always help them find a real path through it, honestly, a longer, calmer sale timeline, a hard conversation with their own lender about restructuring, whatever they actually wanted to pursue. But I would not sign. And I told them, gently, that I had already told Roy as much 3 weeks earlier, in private, specifically so this moment would not be the first time either of them heard any of it out loud. For a moment, nobody in that room said anything at all. Lenora looked down at the appraisals, as though she expected the numbers to rearrange themselves if she looked hard enough. "This can't be right," she finally said quietly, to no one in particular. "We were going to sell the Delmar house at a profit. That was always the plan." I told her, gently, that I understood that had been the plan, and that I was very sorry the numbers didn't support it anymore, and that I hadn't been the one to change them. Roy did not raise his voice. Lenora did. She stood up, actually stood up, at a mediation table, and asked Roy, in front of all of us, in front of the court reporter typing every single word of it, whether he had known about any of this, and simply said nothing to her. And Roy, for the first time in the 8 years I had known him, told the truth out loud, in front of witnesses, about his own father, about a fear he had carried since he was 9 years old, about a number he had been too ashamed to say to his own wife's face for over a year. It was not a villain's confession. It was a frightened man finally setting down something he'd been quietly carrying for 6 decades. I still held him accountable for every decision he'd made alone in the dark, to avoid saying it sooner, because a person can be genuinely afraid and still choose, year after year, to let that fear cost the people standing closest to him. Roy was both of those things at once, fully, and the room had gone quiet enough by then that everyone in it understood it, without my having to say so. Mrs. Abernathy closed the trustee matter on the record within the hour. The financial conversation ended without any agreement at all, which was, itself, the only agreement that mattered. Lenora did not speak to me again that day. She gathered her purse and her attorney's arm and left the way you leave a room you've quietly decided, on your way out the door, to pretend was smaller than it actually was. The rest came the way real consequences usually do, slowly, and then all at once. Within 4 months, Roy and Lenora sold 2 of the 6 properties, at a real loss but not a catastrophic one, enough to stabilize the remaining 4, with a lender who turned out, according to Roy, to be considerably more patient than either of them had any right to expect going in. Roy told Lenora everything eventually, all of it, on his own, without me anywhere in the room. Their marriage survived it, I think, mostly because it had already survived worse, quieter things for far longer. Lenora's warmth toward me did not fully return that year, and I stopped waiting for it to. Roy, though, started calling my office again within a few months, not about money this time, just to talk, the particular way a person calls, once they've finally stopped needing to perform being fine for you. He apologized to me once, quietly, in a parking lot after a Sunday dinner nearly a year later, for the birthday party, for the petition, for 6 weeks of assuming a piece of paper said something he had simply never once bothered to actually read. I told him I appreciated it. I meant every word of that. Lenora's attorney sent a formal notice withdrawing the trustee petition 11 days after the mediation, a single dry paragraph that took a legal assistant maybe 90 seconds to type, and had taken the rest of us the better part of a year to earn. The guardianship visitation stayed exactly as it was always going to stay, 1 Saturday a month. And I want to tell you Elodie still loves those Saturdays. card games and all, because a grandmother can be wrong about a great many things and still be someone worth an afternoon of gin rummy. Lenora never once brought up the mediation to me directly again, not that year, not the next. But she started sending Elodie's report cards back with little notes in the margins, small ones, proud ones, the kind of thing she'd never bothered with before any of this happened, and I have decided, for my own sake as much as anyone else's, to let that count for something. We eat dinner most Sundays now at our own table, not theirs, with Elodie doing homework at one end and Theo drying dishes at the sink, and a lamp left on in the front window because I like coming home to a house that already looks lived in. Elodie is 11 now. Last June I clasped a new charm onto her bracelet myself, a tiny scale, the kind that balances evenly on both sides, because I thought Gideon would have appreciated the joke, and because I wanted my daughter to have one more small, physical thing to hold on to that had nothing at all to do with what anyone in this family was ever willing to fight over in a room with a court reporter in it. Here's what I've learned out of all of it, and I think it's worth passing on. Legacy that has to be defended in a mediation room was never legacy to begin with. It was only ever a claim, wearing a nicer word. And you can love people, genuinely, for your whole life, and still refuse to co-sign their choices, and both of those things can be entirely true on the very same Thursday afternoon. That's my story. One trust a careful old man wrote decades before anybody needed it, one folder of numbers nobody in that room particularly wanted read out loud, and a bracelet that has exactly one more charm on it than it did last June. If someone in your life only wants your name on the paperwork when it happens to benefit them, take this as your sign that love and liability were never the same thing, and you are entirely allowed to know the difference between them. Share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.